Hi, this is Kathy from GadgetStop 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at Private Reserve Infinity Black. I'll do a writing sample with Infinity Black on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a Pilot Stub Nib. I'll look at writing samples that I did earlier on other types of paper. Instead of comparing this swatch of Private Reserve Infinity Black to swatches of other black inks in my collection, I'll be comparing their water resistance. I didn't get a drip at the end of the swatch like I typically do. In fact, this ink had trouble holding on to the paper, and I had the same issue on Rhodia paper. I had to try 4 different times, and I got that, finally ended up with a partial swatch in that same little line at the bottom like I got here. I had similar issue on the Tsubame ink collection card. It had trouble grabbing the paper at first, but then made a nice swatch with a little drip at the end with just the very faintest halo of possibly red sheen. And I've got a little bit of shininess on the swatch, but I would say this is not a sheening ink. The reason I got this sample of ink is because it's marketed as an ink that will not dry out in the nib, and in fact you can leave your pen uncapped a little bit longer than normal without the nib drying out. And I've had trouble with most inks drying out in the nib of this Monteverde Pocket Ripma with the little small Omniflex nib. So with all the rest of the pens that I'm going to be doing writing samples with, they've just been dipped in the bottle of ink. And that's what I usually do when I'm doing these writing samples. But for this pen, I've got a converter inked up, and you can see I've been sitting here for a while with it uncapped, and we're going to see if it hard starts. Started right up. This is a very versatile and enjoyable nib to write with. The regular side writes with a very fine stubbiness to it. The downward strokes are just ever so slightly wider than the side strokes. And this nib writes a little bit wider than I typically prefer. It's more of a medium fine. I really like my Pilot Fine nibs, and this is just slightly wider than that, but the stubbiness of it makes it write finer, makes it feel like a finer writing experience. And the reverse writing is excellent. Just a very versatile and enjoyable nib to write with. The only issue is most of the inks I've tried in it dry up and hard start, with the exception of Diamine Earl Grey. And I wanted to try one of these Infinity inks just to see if it would work with this nib and maybe give me some more options, some more variety to use with this pen that I really enjoy. Yeah, I've been sitting here and it does not dry up. That's nice. Next, I've got a Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. A very pleasant writing experience. This nib is very extra fine, but this ink is so opaque and inky black that I can write with a light hand and it shows up nice and crisp. Very nice. Next, I've got my Pilot Vanishing Point. It has an 18 karat extra fine nib. All right, a little bit of a skip there, and it could just be that this nib has just been dipped in the ink, and this is not one of my standard nibs that have the large feed with bins to hold ink, so I don't know if that could affect this, but it is still writing. And on this smooth Tomoe River paper, this is nice, but oh, it's starting to skip. I might just be running out of ink in this teeny tiny feed. But I did notice on lesser quality paper like my copy paper, it didn't feel quite as nice as the Kakuno. And that could just be that this nib is not the best for dip testing because of the tiny little feed. Next, I've got a Faber-Castell Ambition. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. This extra fine nib is very smooth, especially on this smooth Tomoe River paper with this inky black ink that you can write with a lighter hand with. Now you can see this extra fine is much wider than the Pilot extra fines. It's a little bit more narrow than the Omniflex nib on the Pocket Ritma, but this was just very enjoyable. But this is probably the widest nib that I would enjoy using a black ink in. I do prefer very fine nibs when I'm writing with a black ink, and you'll see that most of the pens I'm going to be writing with these writing samples are extra fine and fine. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Prera. It has a stainless steel fine nib. A little bit of a hard start there, probably because this was just dipped in the ink, but I would have thought that this type of ink would have prevented that from happening. I like this black ink in this Pilot fine nib. This is, let me see, I would classify that as smooth. Not as smooth as the Faber-Castell, but only because it's just a hair more narrow. Next, I've got a Pilot Grants. It has a 14 karat fine nib. I wouldn't call it smooth, but it is very nice. I mean, it's a fine nib, so you're going to feel it on the paper. Not a whole lot different than the Prera. Very nice. Now, I was pleasantly surprised with this pen because I typically think of this fine nib as a little more firm than like the number 5 size 14 karat gold nib like on the Custom 74. This is a number 3 size nib. It's just slightly smaller. But after writing with these stainless steel nibs, I do feel a little bounce. It's nice. It's pleasant. Let's see, I've been sitting here with the cap off. That's nice. Next, I'll be writing with a Sailor Pro Gear Slim. It has a 14 karat fine nib. On this Tomoe River paper, this is nice and smooth. The wetness is not much different than the Pilot Grants when you look at the ink smear, but it feels a bit drier. Or maybe not necessarily feels a bit drier, but yeah, I would say it feels just slightly drier, even though it's still smooth on this paper. But it also just looks a bit drier. The characters, the letters look a little more wispy. I think it looks good with this black ink. Now, not all inks I find that appealing, but I guess that's just a matter of preference. Some people like their black inks to be really opaque. And I have to say, I think I prefer the way it looks in the Pilot Fine nib. It just looks a bit more bold. Next, I'll be writing with a Platinum 3776. It has a 14 karat fine nib. This is very nice. I wouldn't call it smooth. I feel the feedback on the page, but the ink is so inky black. I hear that scritchy scratchy sound in this black ink with this black pen and this beautiful nib. It's just very pleasant. It doesn't feel scratchy at all. It is just very nice. And even though it looks like it's putting down about the same amount of ink as the Pilot Grants, and they both look a bit more bold than this ProGear Slim. Next, I've got a Conklin Minigraph. It has a stainless steel stub nib. A little bit of a hard start there, and I had an issue with a hard start earlier. I'll talk about it with one of the other writing samples. This is nice and smooth, not as wet as I thought it would be. It looks like it's writing much more wet than that. This little hard start, I'm not sure. Maybe with this being a stub, maybe it was just the rotation of the nib. Maybe I didn't have it straight when I started writing. And finally, I've got a Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel CM nib. This nib is not very wet at all, but with this paper, surprisingly, it feels very luxurious, very velvety. I was surprised because on a couple of the other writing samples, I had some trouble with this nib, and I will talk about that when I discuss those other writing samples, but on this paper, it was very nice. Okay, let's take a look at the writing sample that I did on Rhodia. The trouble that I had getting the ink to grab the paper with the tweezer swatch, I think translated to the trouble that I had with the two stub nibs. Now, I had trouble getting the ink to grab the paper at first with the Pilot CM nib. You also may see it described as a 1.0 stub nib, and it wasn't the rotation of the nib. I had to press a little extra hard to get the ink to grab the paper, and even throughout the rest of the writing sample, I was pressing just slightly harder. I didn't have to press hard, just slightly harder than normal when I'm writing with a fountain pen. Kind of think of it like writing with a ballpoint. You have to push just a little harder to get the ink to transfer to the paper. That's the issue I had with the Metropolitan, and it just wasn't as enjoyable as it normally is writing with a fountain pen. And the Conklin Minigraph, I had trouble getting it to write. It was just constantly skipping. Now let me explain how I did this writing sample. I dipped all the pens in ink, and I did the writing samples on my ink collection card. I did the writing samples for my water test and so that it could set and dry. And I let the pen sit for a minute and I came back up to write. The Conklin just did not want to grab the paper. In fact, I had to re-dip it and then do a writing sample. Now, none of the other pens did I have to re-dip. Everything else wrote nicely, nice and smooth, very enjoyable on this Rhodia paper. Now, I was surprised that the Conklin Minigraph was having trouble writing, but it's the only one that a few little dots wanted to come through the Rhodia paper. That was a surprise. Even these big splotches where lots of ink came out of the tweezer swatch, nothing came through. Now, I just don't like writing on copy paper with fountain pens. I don't like that feeling of the ink spreading. I don't like sometimes the more scratchiness that you feel. But every so often, I'll have a nib and ink combination that just work with this absorbent copy paper. The Monteverde Ritma, the reverse writing was fine enough that it was very pleasant. Now, the regular writing was a little bit too wet, and you could see the ink spreading, so that was unpleasant. Surprisingly, the Faber-Castell Ambition, I thought with it being slightly wider than the Pilot Fine nibs, I thought it might be too wet, but it was pleasant. The Pilot Grants was pleasant. The Conklin Minigraph was okay on this paper. I think it's because the ink was maybe spread out a little bit, but that didn't work for the Pilot Metropolitan. Again, I was just having to press on the paper too hard. Now, there are so many conditions. There are very few hard and fast rules with fountain pens. On the inks that I've tried so far with my Vanishing Point Extra Fine, they've all been really pleasant on copy paper, but this one was not. The Kakuno was a bit better. Now, this copy paper is thicker than most trashy copy paper, so it's not a surprise that there's not much bleed through. The only dots that I'm seeing are a couple of dots from the Conklin Minigraph and from the Pocket Ritma, but not bad at all. The only issue I had with these was the spreading. This is the water resistance test that I did on Rhodia paper. I used each of the pens that I did writing samples on the other papers and let it dry for a couple hours. And you can see there is water resistance in the sense that it's still legible after being submerged in water for 10 minutes, but it blows out on the paper. The ink that is lifting off the paper doesn't completely leave the paper, and that does take away a little bit of the legibility. Now, I did some writing samples with all the black inks from my collection, and I let them dry for a while. Now, I did my writing sample for these with my glass dip nib, and you can see that some of the inks came off the nib a little bit more than others, a little bit quicker, so they look a little bit blobbier. One of the things I noticed was that Noodler's Heart of Darkness tended to spread on the paper. Private Reserve Infinity Black came off the glass dip nib very crisp and uniformly. It was nice. Now, after I dipped them in water for 10 minutes, you can see Private Reserve Infinity Black didn't blow out quite as bad as the Sailor Gentle Black, the Iroshizuku, and the Aurora Black. It's much more water resistant than the Diamine Onyx Black, but of course, Noodlers are known for their water resistant black inks. Of the three Noodlers inks, X-Feather is my favorite. It does blow out a little bit. Like Noodler's Black, nothing moves. But Noodler's X-Feather is much more black and opaque in the writing. Okay, on the Tomoe River. This is a black ink. I'm not Oh, it looks like it almost wanted to bleed through. It's just on the verge of coming through the paper. That's a pretty heavy drip right there. And it's a black ink, so we are getting some ghosting. There's a tiny bit of sheen down here on this heaviest bit of the swatch. I would call that a black sheen. It's hard to tell. But in the, well, I was going to say in the writing, there's no sheen, but on the Pilot Prera, oddly enough, it looks almost like the ink is still wet. And on the Conklin Minigraph, I'm getting a little bit of sheen. Looks like it's wet, but it's not. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.